Detective Miles Bennett adjusted his collar against the crisp autumn air as he stepped out of his car in Crestwood, Vermont. This quiet town, nestled near the edge of a sprawling forest, felt worlds apart from his bustling hometown of Hartford, Connecticut. Miles had seen his fair share of strange cases, but something about this one felt different. The call from his former partner, now the local sheriff, had piqued his interest. A dog, seemingly abandoned, had attached itself to a grave labeled simply John Doe. Despite countless attempts, no one could convince the dog to leave the site. The townsfolk, intrigued by the animal's loyalty, had taken to calling it Guardian. Walking towards the cemetery, Miles spotted Sheriff Earl Stanton leaning against his patrol car with a wary expression. They exchanged nods, old familiarity passing between them. Earl's salt-and-pepper hair was now mostly silver, and he looked as if he'd grown weary of more than just law enforcement. "Miles, you've got to see this for yourself," Earl said, nodding toward the graveyard beyond. "I thought maybe it was just some stray, but it's been here every day, rain or shine, guarding that grave like it's on some personal mission." Instead, it sniffed his hand, as if assessing him, then returned to its steady vigil beside the grave. Earl gave a dry chuckle. "Looks like it trusts you already. It's got spirit, that's for sure. But nobody knows a thing about this John Doe. The grave was dug about a month ago. No name, no background, just someone forgotten." The grave's simplicity, coupled with the dog's eerie loyalty, stirred something in him. "Any leads on the identity?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Earl shook his head, his expression solemn. "Nothing. We looked through missing persons records, local databases, even called a few contacts out of state. There's no trace of who he was or how he ended up here." His curiosity grew. "You know, Earl, animals have a way of sensing things we don't. I'd bet my badge this dog knows more about that grave than we do." The dog's presence weighed heavily on his mind as he returned to his temporary lodgings that night. Thoughts tangled with questions. Later, after several calls to nearby towns yielded no information, Miles found himself back at the grave, this time alone. The dog, still beside the headstone, greeted him with a quiet, almost respectful bark. Miles lowered himself to sit beside it, silence enveloping them both as the evening grew darker. He couldn't shake the feeling that this animal was more than just a lost pet, that its attachment to the grave was deliberate, a choice made with purpose. With no leads and little support from local law enforcement, Miles was left with the unyielding loyalty of the dog as his only guide. The morning in Crestwood was cool as Miles settled into the town's small library, flipping through faded records. The librarian, Ada, seemed intrigued. When he mentioned the nameless grave, her brow furrowed. "You're not the first one curious about that," she whispered. "A few locals have wondered, but Sheriff Stanton doesn't like people digging around too much." Most incidents were minor, local disputes, a few unsolved burglaries, and missing persons cases from years ago. But one detail caught his attention. 2 decades back, a string of disappearances had left a scar on the community. Families had reported loved ones missing, and each case had gone cold. The last on that list was Claire Hodges, a young woman who had vanished without a trace. As he jotted down notes, his mind began weaving connections. He had no evidence linking John Doe to those disappearances, but the grave's proximity to where those events happened gnawed at him. Just as Miles prepared to dig deeper, the library door creaked open and Sheriff Stanton entered. "What are you doing here, Miles?" Earl's tone was guarded. Miles kept his response casual. "Just getting familiar with the town's history. Figured it couldn't hurt to know more. Crestwood's had its share of troubles, but nothing worth stirring up now. Folks here prefer to leave the past in peace." He was new to the force when those disappearances happened. The animal's unblinking gaze met his, as if urging him on, challenging him to find the truth. Miles crouched beside it, the quiet settling around them like a shroud. "I don't know what brought you here, but I'll figure this out," he murmured to the dog, half to himself. Miles made up his mind to question a few families around town about the past disappearances. That night, in his temporary lodgings, he mapped out what he'd uncovered, drawing connections between each name and each incident. There was a pattern here, he could feel it, a thread connecting the nameless grave, the loyal dog, and Crestwood's unspoken secrets. The evening fog thickened as Miles walked through Crestwood's narrow streets, guided by the dog's unwavering loyalty to the grave. Each step deepened his conviction. Something dark lay buried here, something the townsfolk were determined to keep hidden. His earlier conversations with residents had yielded little. They were fearful or hesitant when it came to discussing the town's past. But the names of the missing lingered, each an unsolved story silenced over the years. He began with a visit to Margaret Hodges, an elderly woman who had lost her daughter Claire 20 years earlier. Margaret moved slowly, with the quiet grace of someone who'd carried grief too long. Leading him into her modest living room, she motioned for him to sit. "Claire was a free spirit," she said, clasping her hands as if clinging to a memory, "but she wouldn't have just left, not without a word." Her voice softened as she shared her story, and Miles sensed both sorrow and disappointment. Margaret remembered the urgency when Claire first disappeared. Neighbors, police, and volunteers combed the woods for days. "We all thought we'd find her," Margaret continued, voice breaking slightly. There was so much hope, so much belief that she'd come back. But as days turned into weeks, the hope faded. Sheriff Stanton, then a young officer eager to prove himself, had been part of the search. But even he eventually seemed to drift away as leads grew scarce. Margaret's tone held a trace of bitterness. Miles couldn't ignore how quickly Earl had dismissed his own investigation. As he left Margaret's house, suspicion settled heavily upon him. It felt as if Earl knew more than he was willing to admit. He spent the next few hours visiting families of other missing persons. Each home he entered bore quiet sorrow, reflected in parents' eyes and tense silences. Patterns emerged, reluctance among authorities, whispered sightings of figures near the woods, and rumors dismissed as nonsense. Each answer brought more questions. By the time he left the last house, Miles's unease had grown into determination. That evening, he returned to the cemetery, where the dog lay beside the grave, vigilant. The fog had grown thick, swirling around them both. The dog's silent vigilance mirrored his own resolve, a quiet promise that the search wouldn't end here. Miles crouched beside it, rubbing its fur. "Seems no one here wants to talk," he muttered. The dog let out a low whine, as if sharing his frustration. "But we're not giving up, are we?" Signs of recent activity were unmistakable: scraps of fabric, old tools, and a faint trail leading toward town. Before he could investigate further, the crunch of leaves underfoot pulled his attention. Sheriff Stanton appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face shadowed and expression tense. "What are you doing out here, Miles?" The question sounded more like an accusation than curiosity. Miles met his gaze unflinchingly. "Following leads, Sheriff. This place isn't as forgotten as everyone claims." With or without Stanton's support, he was close to uncovering something crucial, something that would finally reveal the truth Crestwood had long kept buried. Ready to face whatever shadows lay in the town's past, he turned from the sheriff, prepared to see his search through to the end.